Coffin.
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 棺材
The coffin was carried by 6 pallbearers.
The coffin was carried by 6 pallbearers.
棺材由6名抬棺人抬着
Cemetery.
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 墓地
The cemetery was full of gravestones.
The cemetery was full of gravestones.
墓地里到处都是墓碑
Funeral.
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 葬礼
The funeral will be held next week.
The funeral will be held next week.
葬礼将在下周举行
Hearse.
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 灵车
The hearse led the procession to the cemetery.
The hearse led the procession to the cemetery.
灵车带领队伍前往墓地
Grave.
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 坟墓
The grave was decorated with flowers.
The grave was decorated with flowers.
坟墓上摆满了鲜花
Mourn.
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 哀悼
The family gathered to mourn the loss of their loved one.
The family gathered to mourn the loss of their loved one.
家人聚在一起哀悼他们所失去的亲人
Pallbearer.
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 抬棺人
The pallbearers carried the coffin to the grave.
The pallbearers carried the coffin to the grave.
抬棺人把棺材抬到了坟墓
Cremation.
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 火化
The deceased had requested cremation.
The deceased had requested cremation.
逝者曾要求火化
Eulogy.
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 悼词
The pastor gave a touching eulogy.
The pastor gave a touching eulogy.
牧师发表了感人的悼词
Obituary.
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 讣告
The obituary was published in the local newspaper.
The obituary was published in the local newspaper.
讣告在当地报纸上刊登了
Gravestone.
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 墓碑
The gravestone had the deceased's name and dates of birth and death.
The gravestone had the deceased's name and dates of birth and death.
墓碑上刻有逝者的姓名、出生日期和死亡日期。
Cemetery plot.
Cemetery plot.
Cemetery plot.
Cemetery plot.
墓地地块。
The family purchased a cemetery plot for their loved one.
The family purchased a cemetery plot for their loved one.
家人为他们的亲人购买了一块墓地。
Interment.
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 埋葬。
The interment will take place tomorrow.
The interment will take place tomorrow.
埋葬将于明天进行。
Procession.
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 行列。
The procession followed the hearse to the cemetery.
The procession followed the hearse to the cemetery.
行列跟随灵车前往墓地。
Wake.
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 守夜。
The family held a wake for their loved one.
The family held a wake for their loved one.
家人为他们的亲人守夜。
Shroud.
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 寿衣。
The deceased was dressed in a white shroud.
The deceased was dressed in a white shroud.
逝者身穿白色寿衣。
Urn.
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 骨灰盒。
The urn contained the ashes of the deceased.
The urn contained the ashes of the deceased.
骨灰盒里装着逝者的骨灰。
Epitaph.
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 墓志铭。
The epitaph read, "Rest in peace."
The epitaph read, "Rest in peace."
墓志铭上写着安息。
Burial.
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 埋葬。
The burial took place at sunset.
The burial took place at sunset.
埋葬在日落时进行。
Casket.
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 棺材。
The casket was made of polished wood.
The casket was made of polished wood.
棺材是用抛光木材制成的。
Obsequies.
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 丧礼。
The obsequies were conducted according to tradition.
The obsequies were conducted according to tradition.
丧礼按照传统进行。
Paul.
Paul.
Pall.
Pall.
殡葬布。
The pall was draped over the coffin.
The pall was draped over the coffin.
殡葬布覆盖在棺材上。
Plot.
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 墓地地块。
The family purchased a plot in the cemetery.
The family purchased a plot in the cemetery.
家人在墓地购买了一块地块。
Repose.
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 安息。
May he rest in eternal repose.
May he rest in eternal repose.
愿他永远安息。
Wreath.
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 花环。
The wreath was made of white roses.
The wreath was made of white roses.
花环是用白玫瑰制成的。
Cross.
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 十字架。
The cross was placed on top of the grave.
The cross was placed on top of the grave.
十字架放在坟墓上方。
Death certificate.
Death certificate.
Death certificate.
Death certificate.
死亡证明。
The death certificate listed the cause of death as heart failure.
The death certificate listed the cause of death as heart failure.
死亡证明上将死因列为心脏衰竭。
Funeral director.
Funeral director.
Funeral director.
Funeral director.
丧葬业者。
The funeral director helped the family plan the funeral.
The funeral director helped the family plan the funeral.
丧葬业者帮助家人策划葬礼。
Obsequy.
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 丧礼。
The obsequy was a solemn affair.
The obsequy was a solemn affair.
丧礼是一个庄重的场合。
Palliative care.
Palliative care.
Palliative care.
Palliative care.
临终关怀。
The hospice provided palliative care for the terminally ill.
The hospice provided palliative care for the terminally ill.
临终关怀机构为晚期病人提供了服务。
Requiem.
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 安魂弥撒。
The choir sang a requiem for the deceased.
The choir sang a requiem for the deceased.
合唱团为逝者唱了一首安魂弥撒。
Shovels.
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 铲子。
The family used shovels to fill in the grave.
The family used shovels to fill in the grave.
家人用铲子填坟墓。
Undertaker.
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 殡仪服务员。
The undertaker prepared the body for burial.
The undertaker prepared the body for burial.
殡仪服务员为遗体做好了埋葬准备。
Vigil.
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 守夜。
The vigil was held at the deceased's home.
The vigil was held at the deceased's home.
守夜在逝者家中举行。
Wake.
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 守夜。
The wake was a time for family and friends to say goodbye.
The wake was a time for family and friends to say goodbye.
守夜是家人和朋友告别的时间。
Ashes.
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 骨灰。
The ashes were scattered over the ocean.
The ashes were scattered over the ocean.
骨灰被撒在了海洋上。
Burial ground.
Burial ground.
Burial ground.
Burial ground.
墓地。
The burial ground was located on a hilltop.
The burial ground was located on a hilltop.
墓地位于山顶上。
Catafalque.
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 殡仪台。
The catafalque was decorated with flowers.
The catafalque was decorated with flowers.
殡仪台上摆满了鲜花。
Condolence.
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 吊唁。
The family received many messages of condolence.
The family received many messages of condolence.
家人收到了许多吊唁信息。
Crematorium.
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 火葬场。
The crematorium was located on the outskirts of town.
The crematorium was located on the outskirts of town.
火葬场位于城镇郊区。
Deceased.
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 逝者。
The deceased was a beloved member of the community.
The deceased was a beloved member of the community.
逝者是社区中备受爱戴的成员。
Embalm.
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 预处理。
The body was embalmed before the funeral.
The body was embalmed before the funeral.
葬礼前对遗体进行了预处理。
Funeral procession.
Funeral procession.
Funeral procession.
Funeral procession.
葬礼队伍。
The funeral procession stretched for several blocks.
The funeral procession stretched for several blocks.
葬礼队伍延伸了好几个街区。
Inter.
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 埋葬。
The body was interred in the family plot.
The body was interred in the family plot.
遗体被埋葬在家族墓地中。
Pallbearer.
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 抬棺人。
The pallbearers were close friends of the deceased.
The pallbearers were close friends of the deceased.
抬棺人是逝者的亲密朋友。
Plot.
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 墓地地块。
The family purchased a plot next to their loved one.
The family purchased a plot next to their loved one.
家人在他们的亲人旁边购买了一块地块。
Remembrance.
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 纪念。
The remembrance service was held on the anniversary of the deceased's death.
The remembrance service was held on the anniversary of the deceased's death.
纪念仪式在逝者去世周年纪念日举行。
Urn.
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 骨灰盒。
The urn was placed on a shelf in the family's home.
The urn was placed on a shelf in the family's home.
骨灰盒放在家庭的书架上。
Wreath.
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 花环。
The wreath was laid on the grave.
The wreath was laid on the grave.
花环被放在坟墓上。